Ready? All right. Good morning, everybody. We're on topic 3, which is oceanography, covering science in the book of Job, answering the questions. Because the book of Job is full of great questions with scientific insight that were not answered to Job, but through a couple thousand years of science, we've come up with some of the answers. And it's just a great way for us to understand the greatness of God in the context of science that's in the Bible. And with oceanography, there's 2 paragraphs in Job 38 that talk about the oceans. Chapter 38, verses 8 through 11 says, "Or who shut in the sea with doors when it burst forth and issued from the womb? When I made the clouds its garment and thick darkness its swaddling band, when I fixed my limit for it and set bars and doors, when I said, 'This far you may come, but no farther, and here your proud waves must stop.'" And then 16 through and 17, "Have you entered the springs of the sea, or have you walked in search of the depths? Have the gates of death been revealed to you, or have you seen the doors of the shadow of death?" There's a few others that we'll talk about briefly, but those are the main 2. And God asks these questions that relate to oceanography. God set boundaries. He asks if Job has traveled to the springs of the sea or walked in the deepest parts, describing the ocean's depths with terms like springs and channels and recesses. These passages can be viewed as a poetic and theological reflection on God's power to control the oceans, with later scientific discoveries confirming that the sea has features like hydrothermal vents and deep channels. So let's talk about control and boundaries. God set limits. God set limits on the ocean. Now, if you look at modern climatology, they're worried about sea levels rising. What's really fun is to look at those who are really into climatology and the sea levels, and they compare a whole bunch of different spaces, and they're like, guys, the ocean has risen by 1/4 of an inch, 3/4 of an inch in some places. And this is over measurable history. But what's really fun is if you look at a different realm of science, the tectonic plates, and the scientists who study those plates, they take the current map and they merge it so that all the plates fit together without the ocean going up or down. God put bars and doors in place. This is about divine control. So let's look at the geological and physical observations. We have coastlines and continental shelves. The light blue in outline here, this is from the USGS website. That's just the coastline of the United States. So the light blue is all of our coastlines. And they've been measured and mapped out, and they haven't changed, except for Louisiana, in the last 100 years. Louisiana's changes are all because of the delta expanding as more silt gets pushed off of our continent into the Gulf of America. So God asked Job, who put the limits in place? Modern geology shows continents have relatively stable coastlines where the ocean's water meets land. Although sea levels can fluctuate over time, and by very little, Earth's configuration, combined with gravity and planetary topography, effectively keeps the ocean within definable boundaries. And the U.S. Geological Survey data on ocean basins is very technical, so I'm not sharing it with you. But if you want to geek out over that, by all means go to the USGS website and look at their measurements of ocean levels. It's very constrained. A second limiting factor is tides and gravitational constraints. And for those of you who don't remember, I don't remember, it was fourth grade science, but earth sciences, we talk about the high tide and low tide, and there's neap tides, which is when the moon and the sun are pulling different directions. The moon being closer has a greater gravitational effect on our oceans, but when the moon and the sun are in the same direction, they pull more water, and you get this fun graphic with that bulge showing how much bigger the high tides are when the sun and moon are pulling in the same direction. It's maybe a foot more of tides, but tides doesn't change the boundaries of the sea. The tides are how God cleans the shores. These do not change the boundaries of the ocean. They just change how much water is at the boundary of the ocean. The interplay between the gravitational pull of the moon and sun and the rotation of the earth creates predictable tidal patterns. While storm surges and tsunamis occur, the regular ebb and flow of tides do not typically overrun the continents. In fact, there have been very few tidal waves that have actually changed coastlines. Most of the time, they destroy all that we build, but not what God put in place. This recurring restraint of the ocean effectively serves as a bar maintaining an observable boundary. So there are places on Earth where the tidal basin is relatively shallow, and the difference between high tide and low tide is during low tide you can walk to an island, and during high tide it is an island. But it doesn't change. There's a really cool island with a monastery. It's a great photographer's dream because within 12 hours you can take a high tide and low tide picture. But that monastery has been there for over 250 years. And they haven't had to change the walls that surround the monastery. They haven't had to change the road because the tides change drastically, but the boundaries of the ocean have not changed. The ocean currents and atmospheric influence. Now, I worked really hard to try and find a graphic that displayed the winds and not the currents. Do you know what's really, really interconnected? The wind in the atmosphere and the currents in the ocean. They are completely connected. Every technical website I went to, I just want to find the winds over the ocean, gave me something like this, which shows the currents, whether it's the Gulf Stream, the equatorial currents, the west drifts. All of those are tied into the way the planet rotates, which creates wind blowing in specific directions, which affects the water underneath it. They're all locked together. God created this so tightly together that you cannot talk about the currents without talking about the wind, and you cannot talk about the wind without talking about the currents. The global wind patterns and the rotation of the earth help form boundary currents, such as the Gulf Stream. Though powerful, these currents still move within vast ocean basins that do not permanently inundate land. Historical changes in sea level, recognized by geologists, further underscore that the water's boundaries are not random, but subject to physical laws that align with the design system. God created the continents and the airflow patterns to create currents in the sea that cycle the water from warm to cold and back again. We'll talk a bit more about currents a little bit, but the wind pushes the water, and that water scours the shores and circulates all sorts of nutrients and trash throughout the ocean's ecosystems. These currents are used by fish, they're used by current ships, they're used by anybody who wants to travel in the sea. But God put those currents in place so that the oceans wouldn't be stagnant. If the earth didn't spin, which we can't fathom that, and the wind wasn't pushing the ocean, then the ocean would sit still, the nutrients would all fall to the floor, and we would not have any ecosystem in the ocean. So all these things are part of God's design for the ocean, and they are currents that keep the ocean in boundaries. When I was young, I found out that San Diego has a triple layer of protection against tidal waves. And to be fair, I've only had 2 tidal wave warnings in my whole life, and both of them amounted to nothing. And a large part of that is we've got a very strong California current that pushes water south. It's cold water that's pushing south. Well, because of the angle of that current, we also have this double layer of protection with La Jolla and Point Loma acting as a shield, and Coronado as another shield. The Silver Strand has washed out once since I don't know when. But even if we had a tidal wave strong enough to overcome the current to hit us, it gets deflected by the current enough, and we've got Point Loma and La Jolla that would block it from hitting most of our cities. That's a cool triple layer of protection for us. If you look at Asia, there's no kinds of protection in their currents. A lot of the reason why we hear about devastating tsunamis and tidal waves out there is because the currents have warm water, which helps storms and helps waves keep their energy high, but it's traveling the same direction as tidal waves would. Most of our earthquakes that would create tidal waves are sending water south from up here, and they go offshore really quick. The few times we've had earthquakes from the south that push up, they fight against the California current and dissipate. Baja California has not had a major tidal wave in a long time, but they would get hit before we would, and all the energy in that gets absorbed by the counter current and by the cliffs on the side of California. Really cool side note, not in Job. Job didn't know about California. All right. Before I get to the springs of the sea, the whole control and boundaries that God is talking about, that God said, thus far you shall come and no farther. This is because God has put in place physical laws that restrain the sea. But it's not just physical laws. It is his word that restrains the sea. As we see an example in Noah's flood, where the waters covered the whole earth. And then God set a rainbow saying, never again will I cover the entire earth with a flood. All right, now let's look at depths and features. God asked Job, have you journeyed to the springs of the sea? And some consider this to be a reference to hydrothermal vents, where superheated water emerges from the ocean floor, a discovery made centuries after the book was written. And this is actually a diagram of how seawater actually goes into the seafloor, goes underneath into aquifers, gets heated by magma underneath the Earth's crust, and then gets vented back up into the ocean. There's whole studies on the life that occurs around these hydrothermal vents. But what was really interesting as I was studying this and looking, well, what are springs in the sea, is that while hydrothermal vents are saltwater vents, there are also freshwater vents in the sea. From an article, June 6th, 2017, geologist Nils Moosdorf and Till Ohlher, these are Scandinavians, from the Leibniz Center for Tropical Marine Research are reporting on an unusual phenomenon which hasn't as yet been covered much in science: submarine groundwater discharge. For many people living on the coasts, these springs are of great benefit and cultural importance. Submarine groundwater springs are widespread but easy to overlook. Science hasn't as yet given them much thought. Quite wrongly, says Nils Muisdorf, geologist at the ZMT. It is estimated that submarine groundwater discharge makes up for 10% of the water carried into the sea through rivers. These are rivers that, instead of springing up on land, they don't break from their aquifer until offshore. Many of them are very close to shore, and there have been, I didn't write this one in, there have been lots of historical stories about Greek divers who would take their furs into the ocean or the Mediterranean Sea and capture fresh water for drinking. There have been many shipwrecked sailors who have survived because of springs in the sea that provide fresh water. And this one I had to put in because Todd Bolin, let's see, this one's Todd Bolin. This one is an offshore aquifer that's freshwater, and you can see how its texture is different from the surrounding saltwater. But this is from Todd Bolin. Todd Bolin is a biblical archaeologist in Israel. And in September of 2011, he wrote an article on springs in the Dead Sea. Now, if you've ever been to the Dead Sea, you know it is extremely salty, but there are freshwater springs all around the shore. But in 2011, they discovered there's also freshwater springs in the middle of the Dead Sea, under the water's surface. A Ben Gurion University research team has discovered a series of deep freshwater springs that spring from the floor of the Dead Sea and help replenish the body's dwindling water supply, while a German group has meanwhile pinpointed new types of microorganisms growing in fissures on the saline seafloor near the springs. Dead Sea groundwater springs have been known and visible for decades as they produce ripples on the water surface, but the current research has given scientists the ability to study springs that are hidden from the eye. The springs can be found at locations within the sea as deep as 30 meters down, and the largest spring observed thus far was 15 meters in diameter, with some spring systems totaling hundreds of meters in length. You want to know something really cool about these springs? They're freshwater fish living in the vicinity of those freshwater springs in the Dead Sea. Evolutionary science can't tell you how those freshwater fish got to be there, because there's no way for freshwater fish to swim through the salt water without dying before they got to the freshwater.
Can they pop up through the crust of the rest of the water?
That's what they're debating currently.
Because in the Mammoth Cave, there's all kinds of river systems under the crust, and there's
Fish down there too. Yeah. You know what's an equally likely explanation? Those fish have been living in the Dead Sea generation after generation since the time of the flood. There had been plenty of fresh water mixed with the salt water, enough to make it brackish where all fish could survive. And they have been living there ever since. But there are fish that live in the Dead Sea near the freshwater springs under the water. Let's look at the phrase, the deepest parts. The phrase walked in search of the depth or walked in the recesses of the deep in Job 38:16, along with descriptions of the Leviathan churning the deep like a boiling pot in Job 41:31, is seen by some as a nod to the complex and varied topography of the ocean floor. Now, how deep is the ocean? Well, this is a diagram of Challenger Deep. The Mariana Trench is the world's deepest canyon system, and it is caused by the subduction of the Pacific Plate under the Mariana Plate. And because of the way that the plates buckle, it's really, really deep. But there are some parts in the Mariana Trench, like Challenger Deep, that are extremely low. And now I'm turning the opposite direction. The Mariana Trench is 36,000 feet to the bottom at Challenger Deep. Now, if you were to flip that, a commercial airliner at cruising altitude is 35,000 feet. So they'd still be 1,000 feet underwater if they had taken off from the bottom of the trench. Mount Everest, the world's highest peak, is 29,000 feet above sea level. If we chopped it off at sea level and tucked it into the Mariana Trench, there'd still be 7,000 feet above Mount Everest of water. Light would not reach the top of Mount Everest if it was centered down there. The Mile High City is 5,280 feet. The world's tallest structure is 2,723 feet. If we wanted to stack the Grand Canyon into the Mariana Trench and Challenger Deep, you could stack 5 Grand Canyons in there, and sunlight still wouldn't touch the top of the Grand Canyon. The Titanic, when it sunk, was at 12,400 feet. You can find snailfish at 25,000 feet. But Mariana Trench at the very bottom has been visited by humans 3 times. James Cameron actually built a special submarine to go to the bottom of Challenger Deep. This is not just a geologic anomaly or curiosity to those fond of ranks and measures. Challenger Deep represents a depth of determination and spirit of exploration of the most implausible sort. It bears witness to the will and capacity of science and engineering to build and pilot crafts that ferry humans to the most remote nook on our planet, giving hope to the prospect of discovering, mapping, understanding, and appreciating the rest of it and beyond. 5 years ago, less than 5% of the ocean was mapped to a high resolution. Today, nearly 20% has been mapped, an incredible leap, but this leaves an astounding 80% of the ocean still awaiting detailed mapping. John Nelson is a chart guy. He creates maps using software, and he created a really cool infographic for Challenger Deep to help understand how deep it really is. It's uncanny how deep it is. It's completely pitch black. If you could free fall through the air that far, you would take 10 minutes to fall all the way down without stopping. It is super deep. People in Old Testament times didn't have any clue how deep the ocean was. They knew it was deep. But honestly, anything past 50 feet to 99% of Earth's population doesn't exist. There are some very deep divers who go diving for pearls and can hold their breath, and they can go up to 60, 120 feet, I think is the record for diving, free diving. No equipment, just go under. But you have to be able to hold your breath in just the right amount and not let too much air out, but you can't hold it all in because the pressure at 120 feet is already significant. The deep parts of the ocean didn't exist to people of biblical times. And even up until the 1800s, nobody realized how deep exactly the ocean could be. If you look at modern maps of oceanography, you'll see lots and lots of detail in the depths and the trenches and the mountains that exist in the ocean. Speaking of terrain, let's look at the undersea terrain, the channels. And I thought this was a cool one because this is just north of Monterey. There are rivers in the ocean. There are canyons in the ocean, and there are mountains in the ocean. The BBC published an article about the giant undersea rivers that nobody knows anything about in July of 2017. These submarine channels were almost completely unknown until the 1980s, when sonar mapping of the seafloor began to reveal them. Many extend out into the ocean from the mouths of major rivers like the Amazon and the Congo, following tortuous routes across the thick sediment on the seafloor. At the time, scientists compared them to mature river systems on land, such as the lower reaches of the Mississippi River. And these rivers are not just rivers of water. They do carry water, but when they reach the water, often they're carrying sediment. There was a study that was being done on this channel, and they kept losing equipment because the equivalent of a mudslide or avalanche was happening on a weekly basis. They developed the affectionately titled beach ball model, which looks like a giant orange beach ball, except it's made out of iron and painted with all these layers, because as these currents flow, they carry these beach ball sensors out and then bury them in sediment, and they have to go take submarines out to unbury them and retrieve the data. They were talking about a river of dirt 3 miles long that just took all their equipment out to sea. The river of dirt was 3 miles long. It took their equipment 10 miles out to sea, and they had to go find it and recover it. The website lifehopeandtruth.com talks about the ocean floor's varied terrain, and it says that today we know the seafloor does have features like springs and mountains. Spring-like hydrothermal vents form where tectonic plates pull apart. Seamounts develop over volcanically active areas. Abundant undersea channels range from deep trenches, where a denser tectonic plate is forced under a more buoyant plate, to what appear to be submerged riverbeds. In fact, some of these channels still powerfully flow with their own currents of water, carrying high concentrations of salt or sediment. The first such undersea river made the news in 2010, as reported in the Daily Telegraph. The channels of many more have been discovered. As Katya Moskovich reported in February 2014 for New Scientist, drain all Earth's oceans and you would find that underwater rivers have gouged a maze of conduits known as abyssal channels. The rivers that rush through them may look like terrestrial rivers, but they behave much more like avalanches, dust storms, or the pyroclastic flows from a volcano. Today, locating these channels of the sea is a major occupation for both telecommunication companies looking to avoid placing their cables near these destructive flows, and oil companies looking to harvest oil and gas from long-buried sediment. However, in biblical times, the landscape deep below the water's surface was out of reach and unfathomable. According to GEBCO, the international authority tasked with bathymetry, mapping the seafloor, a picture only began to emerge in the mid-1800s when sailors started to record ocean depths along their course using weighted ropes. Knowledge of the seafloor increased rapidly when sonar was eventually invented. The details recorded in the Bible anticipate modern discoveries by thousands of years. There was actually a map of the ocean if you drained 6 kilometers of ocean away, like you dropped everything 6 kilometers down. There were still parts of the ocean, like the Mariana Trench, that were still 5 kilometers deep if all the water had been taken off the top. The ocean has so much variety underneath it. And God was asking Job, have you seen these things? Do you understand what the ocean looks like underneath? All right, we'll go back to currents. Oops. Seawater follows currents in the sea. The Bible indicates there are paths in the ocean where water follows a predictable course. Indeed, the interaction of numerous factors, including geography, temperature, salinity, prevailing winds, and the Coriolis effect, create currents with dramatic influence over regional transit, climates, and marine life. Yet these paths in the sea were not extensively studied until the mid-1800s, when Lieutenant Matthew Fontaine Maury of the U.S. Navy began scouring old sailors' logs for information about wind and ocean movements. Maury's study of the Bible, which he constantly read and frequently quoted, had convinced him that he would find patterns, and find them he did. Describing the impact of Maury's first wind and current chart on navigation, Duval wrote, "Previously, the average passage from New York to San Francisco required 188 days. But in 1851, the Flying Cloud made this voyage in 89 days and 21 hours. Studying the paths of the seas turned out to be a lucrative innovation." All right, so what does it mean? Theologically, what does this mean? You look at the divine power versus human limitations. God knew and knows what's going on underneath the ocean. It's not a mystery to him. It's no more mystery to him than what goes on the earth, on the surface, on the crust that's above the water. Nothing's hidden from God's sight. We humans have significant limitations, even with all of our technology and the ability to go to the bottom of Challenger Deep. We've only mapped about 80% of the seafloor. There are tons of shipwrecks where we have ship's logs that we know where the ship went down and we haven't found. Because from the top of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean is a long way. And there are currents that drag things out of where they should have been. And despite all of our technology, God's perspective is still superior. The big difference is his perspective. And he uses the imagery of the ocean, the power of the ocean that he has restrained to show his sovereign authority. And the ultimate point of this is he's talking to Job and he says, if I have control over the sea, the powerful and chaotic oceans, don't you think I can control any aspect of creation? And that includes your life. Talking to Job. He didn't ask that question directly, but he was asking Job all these questions. Do you know what goes on? Have you been in the bottom of the sea? Do you know what goes on underneath the surface? I do. Job, you want to know why you're suffering, but do you understand who I really am? Once Job understood not all the answers to the questions that God was answering, but the point of all these questions, he put his hand over his mouth and said, "It is enough. Stop asking me questions, God. I don't have the answers. You have the answers." And God didn't answer any of these questions for Job. Not even the one Job originally asked, but Job understood the point. If God is big enough to understand the answers to all these questions he's asking me, God is big enough to understand the question I asked him. And if God isn't going to share the answers to all these questions, he doesn't have to share the answer to my question. God doesn't answer to me. God answers to himself. And whether I'm suffering or not, God has allowed this in my life. And God is still in control. If he can keep the ocean from spilling over, he knows what's going on in my life and is only allowing what is going on in my life because of a plan he has. And I don't need the answer to that plan. That is all I've got for you today. What God's great abilities mean to us if he can control the mysterious ocean perfectly. He can control our lives. All the visible factors, all the invisible factors. It's not too complicated for him. All right, questions, discussion, debate, fights? No fights.
It's challenging it's like overwhelming. He's in so much control. And yet, he also gives us free will to balance the component.
It's amazing. Last night I took a shower and was looking at all the hair that was in the shower from all my kids who had taken showers previously. And I go, God knows exactly how many hairs are on each of our heads, and that number is changing constantly, but he cares enough to keep track. That's nuts. Like, it's getting easier and easier for him on me every day, but he still keeps track. That's something he cares about. I don't even care about that at this point, but God does. There's so many things that he just does because he loves us.
It's interesting, a little while back, they were talking about the hurricane down in Mexico. And everybody was all worried about it up here. I said, the water up here is too cold. There's no way. I mean, we grew up on the East Coast or the Gulf Coast. The warm water moves on up through North Carolina easily. And it's a thing that it keeps the energy in those hurricanes. But here, I remember everybody going, oh, hurricane, hurricane. I'm like, it's nothing. There's no way it's going to get through 65-degree water. And it was gone.
Yeah. I was kind of excited about that. I was like, maybe we'll get to see an actual hurricane.
I've seen it. How he works it all. He also tells us to ask for wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not wisdom to know everything. It's wisdom to
Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Comments? All right. See you next week.
Thanks, Paul.